For a time, humanity believed that power was territorial. It resided within borders, occupying space endowed sovereigns to print currency, issue passports, and claim a monopoly on force. But the notion that power begins and ends at the border is starting to come tumbling down, like a great wall. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. Rana Dasgupta thinks the nation-state is breaking down, not with a bang, but with a quiet failure to live up to its promises. States once offered order and upward mobility, but now they're overwhelmed by challenges they can scarcely manage. Capital flows, climate disasters, data regimes, they don't stop at border checkpoints. And neither do large-scale migrations reshaping the globe today. Hundreds of millions of people live outside the places they were born, some by choice, most by necessity. They move through patchworks of rights and exclusions, welcomed here, rejected there, protected in theory, vulnerable in practice. So how do we build belonging in a world where people can't stay put? What kind of politics serves a species in motion? For Dasgupta, this breakdown isn't just political, it's spiritual, because behind the idea of the modern state was a kind of theology, that if you gave up your loyalty to tribe, religion, or class, the state would protect you. But that deal is broken down. In its place, we could imagine something new. Not a global state, but a planetary one. A politics of sovereignty without centralization, an identity without exclusivity. Dasgupta envisions floating citizenship and currencies that emerge not from governments, but from systems of exchange anchored in mobility, trust, and affinity. He suggests we may soon need civic operating systems built on these principles, designed to serve lives lived across borders. Dasgupta is a novelist and essayist who's spent the last decade investigating the breakdown of the fading liberal order of the world. He spoke with Jonathan Blake, a political scientist who directs research for the Berggruen Institute's planetary program. They spoke on the sidelines of our planetary summit in Venice in October of 2024. And now, Rana Dasgupta and Jonathan Blake on Futurology.
Welcome, Rana. It's a honor and a delight to talk to you. I've been a fan of your work for so long, so this is just such a pleasure to sit down and really dig into it.
It is a pleasure. Absolutely.
We're going to be talking today, I think, a lot about the state, the nation state, the relationship, I guess, between these concepts, these terms. But I want to begin a bit earlier than the current work that you've been engaging now for a couple of years. I know you've spent much of your life in the UK. You've spent a lot of time in India. I'm curious, what role have these states played in your own life, and how that process of just living under different types of states, and with ones with entangled histories that we can get into, how that's informed this project?
Enormously. I spent a lot of my life in the US as well. And have engaged, I read a novel set in Bulgaria, which is a country I had nothing to do with, no link to at all. And I wrote that novel while I was living in India. And at that time, I'd lived recently in the US, and then I was in India, and I was rather sick of big countries and their sense that they were the center of absolutely everything. And India and the US have that in common. And I wanted to think my way into another kind of national experience in history. And I think, like lots of people who live in several countries, I think it gave me a sort of skepticism about every national narrative, because you less and less feel yourself included or represented in the parochial stories that states tell, and you see lots of commonalities between what's going on in different countries. So, of course, countries are vastly different from each other, but they exaggerate also their difference, as if they were not part of a single system, or that human life itself was not continuous wherever you went. So I suppose the experience of living in several states, in brief, just gave me less and less of a sense of home in any. And more of a sense that we were all of us, and I think this is also a moment in history rather than just any cosmopolitan experience, that we were all of us part of the same unfolding of forces. And so all of my books reflect that in some way. All of them are about the sort of illusions of national experiences and national narratives, the mighty unfolding forces that are enfolding everybody on the planet, and a lot of the tragedy, I suppose, of many aspects of our segregation into different states.
Do you feel like you belong anywhere, or that you're an insider anywhere, or are you the condition of always being the outsider looking in?
Well, I've recently left the country that I have a passport for, which is the UK, because I can't bear it. And like a lot of people who leave their home country and come back, I find its problems. I'm particularly allergic to its problems. I live in France, which has its own problems, but they're not my problems, and I don't feel so sort of, irritated by them. The UK is also in a particular moment of sort of breakdown of every kind, so it's difficult to be there. So no, I don't really feel that I have a sort of home in a deep sense, but India is a place where I lived for 17 years, and there's something very deep about its energy, particularly at this moment where the country is changing very fast, which is quite addictive, and I don't like to be away from it for too long. France is my adopted country in some ways, and it's a country onto which I always projected a lot of my fantasies of belonging, and so I'm quite happy there. But I'm an outsider everywhere in some sense.
It strikes me that the work you write that makes sense. That's the answer I would have expected. This is somebody writing from a position, I think, of discomfort that allows a sharp diagnosis that the comfortable can't see. And this is something I've been reflecting on a lot recently. I have young children, and I almost don't want them to feel comfortable with where they are. In part because I don't think I ever fully did. And I think there's a sense, and maybe we can get into this. I mean, nationalism, of course, is a sense of ownership, that you do belong, and as of course, therefore others don't. And I don't think I want them to feel that. Yeah,
I totally sympathize. It's, I mean, you get to the heart of it, because I think that that feeling of belonging is always in some ways bound up with a feeling of exclusion. That's sort of the fundamental kind of national condition. So, I think that obviously nation states have been a sort of big preoccupation of mine, and nation states do certain things very well, and many people are very grateful to have a state and to have a home and to have a national culture and all those sorts of things. What is disturbing about nation states, as opposed to, for instance, big land empires like Persia or China, is that these are entities that are cosmologically extensible. Potentially anybody could be a citizen of the Chinese empire. Whereas all nation states are built on exclusion. So there are the insiders, there are the outsiders who have no political being within the state. But then this also creates the uncertain zone of those insiders who might be outsiders. So nation states always have this doubt about who is in and who's out. And there are always categories of people who seem to belong less than others. And so there is a sort of kind of genocidal core to the nation state. It's always about to commit violence on some minority or some foreigner or whatever. And we see that, the greatest violence of recent decades, the last century perhaps, is that particular kind of psychopathic violence that is directed at suspect insiders or suspect citizens. And so when you talk about your kids and whether you want them to feel, unabashedly part of something, and your unease about that. I share that unease. It's not a simple kind of belonging. It's not like the belonging we have to a family or the planet. It's tinged with something else.
This distinction between inside and outside, the very fact that any form of inclusion is immediately and also a form of exclusion, you've rooted, at least in part, in theology. Can you tell us how you see this playing out over the last several thousand years?
Well, I think that, I became interested in theology very early on in my exploration of the state, because I started asking myself, I didn't really know very much about this subject, and I started asking myself, again, I'm an outsider to this too. I'm writing about things that I have no formal sort of training in. So started asking I realized I didn't really know basic things. How did we come to be organized in this way? Mm-hmm. And how did we come to have very, very powerful feelings about nation states? Those feelings that are on display during the Olympics or whatever. And perhaps these are the most sort of attractive versions of those feelings.
If nationalism only displayed itself in Olympic fervor,
in sports,
we'd be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the Olympics is one moment, or the World Cup football is a moment where lots and lots of people in the world become Brazilian for a few weeks because they just. So it's also nice in that way. People shift there. But I think in starting to think about these feelings that we have, I quite quickly got drawn into the realm of religion. Obviously, lots of people have likened nationalism to a religion. It's clear that there's something of that order going on. But when I started to really think about it and look at histories, I realized that it wasn't just a kind of analogy. Actually, these things were part of the same energy, that nation states themselves were theologically grounded, that in order to create a sense of sovereignty, of sovereign authority, every state, and of course there's a difference between states that were created very quickly in the last 70, 80, 100 years, and states that grew up over long periods of time. So I anchor this in France, which has a very long theological sort of development. But all states at some point will gesture to the divine in order to justify, to represent, first of all, the awe-inspiring authority of the state itself, but also to organize the feelings that population should have about those states. So in my sort of journey through French history, I sort of unpack how it was that from a sort of tribal pagan kingdom that emerged from the Roman Empire, France, like all these other tribal pagan kingdoms, kings converted to Christianity. They borrowed the forms of authority that had been generated by the Roman Empire, and gradually they nationalized them. So, of course, Christianity is a universal religion. I mean, Christ is a figure who says there are no outsiders to this faith. And therefore, it was very useful for imperial purposes. But the European kings nationalized it and said, no, God is attached to our local state. And, Louis IX of France purchased in 1238 the most expensive object in the world, which was the purported crown of thorns that Christ had worn on his way to the crucifixion, or at the crucifixion, and used this celestial crown as a kind of spiritual resource to back up his own terrestrial crown. And so these things, they sound very far away, very medieval. What do they have to do with us? I argue essentially that what happened in the Enlightenment, where we sort of designed the cosmological diagram of today's state, people, cosmos, was not a laying to rest of all these medieval energies, but a reformation of those energies, or an adaptation. So the people takes the place of the divine in supplying authority to the state. But God is not dead. God is floating above the state, which is why European states, even to this day, have many problems with Islam and Judaism, continuing problems, because the problem that the Enlightenment was trying to fix was the relationship between Protestants and Catholics, and it did that pretty well. There have not been major sort of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics since that time, say in France. But whether Jews and Muslims were part of the Enlightenment state was a big problem at that time, and it continues to be a question. So these things might seem very abstract, but if you treat liberalism as a kind of reformed Christianity, an adapted kind of Christianity, it helps to explain why in these decades of liberalism's decline, there's such confusing religious outpouring, why there's so much heresy, why metaphysical questions are returning to the center of politics. Why is the status of the unborn child such a huge divisive political question when it would seem an issue for just a personal curiosity or whatever? So I think that we are, and I'm talking here just about Western states, but of course religion at the global scale is an even more explosive force. But we are, having thought that religion no longer played a significant role in politics, we're seeing in nearly every Western state an outpouring of religion, new kinds of religious wars. And I think if we're going to get over these internal problems of states, but also the religious problems between states, because the two big wars we're witnessing right now, Russia and Israel-Palestine, both of these conflicts are in a major way religious. I think we have to return to theology. Theology, which we might have thought was a dead subject, might actually turn out to be an incredibly central discipline for our resolution of our future political problems.
I want to go back to the point you made about liberalism as enlightened to reform Christianity. And I wonder how much you might put really the blame here on liberalism, which of course tried to separate religion and politics and say these are distinct realms of social life, and in particular that politics is public and religion is private. And to what extent liberalism confused and ought, and it is it, it's fine to say this is what it should be. These two things should be separate, but in fact, in reality, they never were. And but we adopted the framework that said that they are. I mean, how much is that really the issue here? So it's not so much, there's often a lot of people write or talk about the return of religion in the state or the, but that it never really went away. It was almost a category error to think that these were separate issues to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I see liberalism as the sort of, again, in the Roman Empire, you had, well, in many states across history, you have elite religions, religions that elites hold, that have a close analogy with state imagination, and they look down on other religions as uncouth, pagan, all that sort of thing. I think liberalism occupies that place today. And liberalism has a particular sense of where that the state has absorbed into itself many of the attributes of the Christian God, and we don't really need to therefore make reference to God in a sort of celestial sense. We've got it all here. But your thing about ought and is absolutely true. I mean, liberals are always talking about how things should be, and how other people should think. And this is they're speaking from a position of entitlement, because they have, with the exception of communism, which is also a state religion and a sibling to liberalism, in a very large number of states, and especially the most powerful states in the world, liberals owned the state. They set up the legal systems, the political systems, and looked down on those who for instance, would like God to be at the center of the state. Today, people who would like the state to have a very different relationship to God are significantly more vocal than they were in the past. And liberals, I think, have lost a lot of their moral prestige. And therefore, we're at this moment of transition where there are immense battles over what exactly is the place of the role of the state. Is the state so immaculate as liberals want to believe? I mean, today there are there's immense mistrust of all state institutions, but also maybe God should be playing an active part of the world. So one of the things that the Enlightenment did, for instance, is to exclude miracles, exclude all divine intervention into earthly affairs so that the state could be absolute. But so you have a lot of strange conversations going on even in the United States about miracles. Trump had people around him in his first presidency who were quite actively calling for miracles in American life. So for all kinds of reasons, liberalism is going through a pretty serious loss of credibility and suffering, I think, from the fact that it has paid too little attention to some of the things you're describing. And just to add to that, I mean, I think some of the most serious omissions of liberalism were in the colonies, in the European colonies. So liberalism, when it comes from within your own country, is one thing, but liberalism, when it's imposed on you as something that should govern how you marry, how your social life should be organized, whether alcohol and prostitution are part of your society, all these kinds of things were very active problems in let's say, in North Africa, in the French colonies in North Africa, where liberalism was viewed as a kind of abhorrence, and where very, very puritanical forms of Islamic theology were generated in response, which now are very, very politically influential.
If over the last 3 centuries, roughly, you see a conflation of the state and God, to what extent do you see the current political upheaval and anti-statism and revanchist nationalism and all these other symptoms that we're seeing of the present, not so much a reaction, an angry reaction against state failure, but a belief that God failed you? Soviet communism famously described as the God that failed. Is there something to this that people are feeling just completely abandoned, not only by the state, but therefore also by the divine?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that the depth and the intensity of political passions today is to do with the fact that the covenant that has been broken is not simply an economic bond. So there are a lot of people who are suffering economically in Western countries. They're suffering because services have been withdrawn, because they don't have the same employment structure as before, blah, blah, blah. But these things are not purely economic facts. It is a sacred bargain that I think the Western state have been building up to and was realized in the 20th century, of what this mortal God, as Hobbes called it, could do for you in terms of producing an earthly paradise. That covenant achieved a very high level of sophistication and actualization in the second half of the 20th century. And I think the withdrawing, the gradual withdrawing of the state from that position since then has been experienced as a shattering spiritual breakage. Which is why I think it's more significant in the West than elsewhere, because lots of other states never made such promises or could never fulfill such promises. So I think people in states where such a situation never arose are more pragmatic about state failure But state failure in the West is experienced as quite a spiritual crisis, I think.
Can you say more about the sacred bargain between the state and its citizens, and how it's come apart?
Well, I think, this is a very long process, but essentially the promise made by, let's say, Enlightenment philosophers of what democracy might look like, what equality might look like, what a just state might look like, that had no care for status and all those sorts of things, that would deliver equally to all citizens. The very idea of citizenship as a breakage from feudal power relations, these were immense promises, and all of us have sort of memories of what that message did in the 18th century. Delacroix's paintings of sort of the revolutions of 1830. These are the sort of passionate moments of the late 18th and on throughout the 19th century. People would die for these things. They would kill. They would, we think of the Haitian Revolution. We think of the revolutions in the United States and especially France. These are titanic modern forces that are unleashed simply by constitutions and messages and promises. But those promises were not really fulfilled for a very, very long time. I mean, the 19th century in all of these states is a century, and indeed the first half of the 20th. These are decades, 2 centuries really, of immense struggle for things that have been promised but never delivered. Whether it's equality between men and women, between races, the idea of universal suffrage takes a long, long time to be delivered in these states. So when it comes, and it comes also, the 2 world wars are the kind of moment where a lot of these concessions are made by states. So at last, in the 1920s, these European states, which have been basically war machines for centuries, at last they start to spend more on welfare than they do on war. They're authentically welfare states that are devoted to the development of their populations. At last, after the Second World War, with immense sacrifice on the part of populations, all kinds of social goods are delivered in terms of education, institutions. So this is a sort of long spiritual battle within the West. I mean, you could call it a political battle, but I think that when blood is on the table, when blood sacrifice, not only in war but also in protests and all kinds of things, then it acquires a spiritual dimension, a dimension of immense sacrifice. And that's why I think the populations have longer memories than we think they do. When our newspapers don't talk about these kinds of things, but in actual fact, the First World War still arouses immense sort of nostalgia, grief, passion in the West. So that accumulated sacrifice is meaningful. So when the things that you died for, your ancestors died for, are then destroyed or taken away, it is very, very traumatic. People count that blood of the past. This is the case in all countries in different ways. I mean, China has a very different story, but also immense sacrifice. That's why I count it as a bargain between state and people that is much more than at the level of economic transaction.
This framework has just made me think of something I don't think I'd really put in this language before, but in fact, over the last couple of centuries, right, if the state steps in and says, we'll take the role of the church as kind of your primary allegiance that you're willing to die for, and where the church offered you, if you make your commitment, are willing to die, you can have eternal salvation. The state says, forget about that. We'll offer you this worldly salvation. We'll raise you up in this life. And then when that fails, you have populations left with neither form of salvation.
Right.
And which is a recipe for chaos, for disaster, for political and spiritual collapse. It's really useful.
Well, that is a nice way of formulating it. But and it makes it even stronger because, yes, of course, you've burnt all your bridges, as it were. Though I think that the sort of you can map sort of inversely the sort of rise of state capacities or the fall of state capacities and the rise of sort of religious aspirations. I mean, we're talking here primarily about the West, but if you look at, say, the Pentecostal church globally, it's quite astonishing the political power of the Pentecostal church in places where the state is failing its citizens, where the church, not only the church, many religious organizations, but the Pentecostal church is particularly dramatic in the post-1980s era in terms of its sort of global rise and spread, because it promises a lot of these things together. It promises eternal salvation and everything. But a lot of these Pentecostal churches also promise to equip you, essentially, equip people who belong to, let's say, the bottom third of the globe, people who are in hyper-competitive, deregulated global workforce, to equip them to educate their kids, save money, avoid alcohol and other things that would make them less efficient as workers, to participate in to contribute some of their money to the church, so the church can also redistribute internally and support the sick and the unemployed. So a lot of people globally, I'm thinking of places like Ghana, Nigeria, lots of Latin America, are putting a lot of their faith in these things when states clearly can't do that job.
Right. In the absence of effective governance, effective welfare provision by the state. Yeah, that's right. In much of the world, it's churches and Islamic organizations that have stepped in to build the clinics, to build schools,
of course,
provide loans. It's you have almost a parastatal organization that's explicitly religious. Let's talk a bit more about this failure of the state. We've been talking a lot about the West, but of course, it's even more acute in the post-colonial regions and in the global South broadly. How has the state failed?
Well, I wouldn't put it that starkly. I mean, yes, there are some states that have completely failed, but there are a relatively small number of states that would be called technically failed states. And the post-colonial world is an extremely varied zone, especially because Asia has really pulled away from the rest. And, Asia is to some extent the sort of the most interesting and dynamic continent right now because it's sort of bucked the trend of the rest of the nation-state system. So broadly, patterns of wealth and power distribution that existed in 1900 have remained the same, with this one exception of Asia that's hugely changed its position. And that goes for the poorest and the richest countries in Asia. So you certainly couldn't say that India was a failed state today. India in some ways is a remarkably functional state, despite all kinds of things, still immense levels of poverty and all those sorts of things. But as a state, because states haven't existed independent of their populations, as a state, it's very successful. But I think that if we look at the nation-state system as a whole, as an integrated system, i.e., it is a single political and economic zone, and I think we have to think about it like that. Otherwise, we get too involved in what is going on in any one state, and we tend to therefore judge our political condition on the basis of outliers. So what is politics like today? Well, we look at Britain or the United States, which are not representative in any way of the system itself. That would be like judging a city on the basis of a few gated communities and saying everything's fine. The system is increasingly is set up to segregate and to concentrate its profits and costs. And because the costs are being concentrated especially in Africa, states simply cannot deal with the needs of their populations. They're unviable as platforms for realizing social objectives. So there's only one thing that populations can really do in response, which is to leave, and they're leaving in large numbers. And some of the countries that I've been to recently, say Gambia, tiny country, almost no capital, very little economic activity going on. That is a major impulse. It's just to find a way to get out.
So in the face of all of these, and I think you're right, failure was perhaps the wrong word to use because obviously it has kind of a specific meaning. We can certainly say they haven't lived up to their promises, or their promise, I should say. I wonder, to what extent is this a problem, a mismatch of scale, that the nation state is a bounded territorial unit, but so many of the problems are unbounded, whether it's flows of global capital, climate change, we can name a litany of them. So to what extent is this simply that the nation state is unable as a form to really do much that it's asked to do? Keep its citizens safe, provide them with a decent living, stop the seas from rising. Is this simply something that a world divided into 193 sovereign states with nice clean lines that you can read on a map, that's just simply can't be the system for the scale of the problems?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I think a lot of the 20th century, many of the problems were national size. Mm-hmm. So governments presided over national economies, and their problems were to resolve conflicts between their populations, develop populations, start to educate populations that were newly sort of entering urban life and all these sorts of things. These were things that national governments could do quite well. Mm-hmm. Today, governments have lost a lot of that authority even over their own territories because of changes in commercial, financial, technological zones, but also a lot of the problems come from outside. And those problems from outside create far more sort of bewilderment than problems inside. So look at the incredible sort of political disarray that arises in Europe from the arrival of a very small number of migrants. So the problems you describe, the planetary problems, the problems that don't fit neatly within any particular state, the way that most states will experience those problems first is migration, outward or inward, or people being displaced within the state. I spend quite a lot of time in India these days looking at farming communities and seeing that climate change is pushing a lot of these communities into total crisis. And it's an open question whether they can adapt quickly enough to survive, because what climate change is basically doing is not so much changing the temperature or whatever, but throwing off all the rhythms of agriculture. So you really don't know when it's going to rain. It rains too much. It doesn't rain for months. So all the sort of accumulated agricultural wisdom is now useless. So there are a couple of billion people in the world who are exposed to this possibility of migration. So here, yes, we do not have any sort of transnational systems that can regulate this problem. And on their own, states are immensely exposed to it. And most of their first impulse, of course, is just to shut their gates in whatever way they can. And powerful states are militarized. They have good resources for doing these things, but it's a temporary fix. So we need to be thinking, I mean, collectively, we, humanity need to be thinking collectively about how we might actually return to a semi-nomadic species in a way that's manageable. Climate change, whether we can fix climate change, whether any of the things that we are doing is going to have consequences in the short term. I'm skeptical about this because I think that we have appointed nation states to fix the problem, but nation states are the primary causes of the problem, and to deliver things to their populations, they need to be extractive. So, I doubt that their impulse to save the future, it can ever be stronger than their impulse to save the present. But it is more plausible that we can think productively and creatively about migration. Because the crisis will quickly get to a point where states themselves have to come to the table in some sort of way. Their populations are already very, very anxious about this issue. And B, because climate change is also producing new opportunities. New territories are becoming habitable. And we don't need to think about migrants as a sort of drain on the global economy. These are economies. These are people who are mobile and have, ambitions, who will trade with each other, who will produce all kinds of new economic systems. So I think that we, as a matter of priority, need to be thinking about how we can legislate a sort of outside to the nation-state system that can produce a set of migration corridors, a set of migration destinations, and even a sort of political infrastructure of citizenship, rights, etc., that can attach to these people who might be stateless in a sort of technical sense. These things, however, run totally counter to everything that we know today. Lots of those territories we're talking about lie in Canada, Russia, and Central Asia. And those are not a collection of states that are instinctively interested in sharing their resources with lots of newcomers, etc. Those conversations are very difficult, and we need to do lots of things. There are there are parallels, or there are precedents for sort of international territories, the Arctic being one of them, international zones which are not owned and which are available for scientific research often. But I think that expanding those kinds of legal concepts into some kind of commons where the normal principles that work in nation states do not operate, and where we can create alternative economic and ecological zones, I think this is an incredibly important area of sort of debate. And only to remind ourselves that, James Scott would say that until 1600, a third of the human race was essentially not belonging to any state and largely nomadic or seasonably nomadic. It's not actually normal for us to have a 100% sedentary species. So creating passages, holes in the system that allow for another kind of existence would only be to acknowledge our fundamental nature as a species. But in addition to that, nomadic, if you look at the relationship between China and the nomadic tribes that lived on its borders for 2,000 years, those nomadic tribes were much, much more ecologically efficient than China itself. So we would also be potentially creating sort of ecological countervailing energies that do not depend on the immense expense of national life.
So we run up against the problem we discussed before, which is that of the nation state is explicitly about the identification and demarcation of insider and outsider, right? Picking up and moving well, let's put it, birds migrate all the time, and that's fine. No one, that doesn't bother anyone. But when people do it, then, no, this body belongs elsewhere, doesn't belong here, outsider, insider. So I'm curious what you say. It's all well and good for someone who is already semi-nomadic and who already feels somewhat an outsider, who already feels not fully at home anywhere, to be able to pick up and move. But what's the response to the people who do feel rooted and grounded in a place and do feel at home, which is clearly a lot of people? What could you say to convince them?
Well, I don't think that I don't think many people become climate refugees voluntarily, or think that that being nomadic is very glamorous. But I think that we have to sort of find ways of marrying these various demands on the planet. So, yes, you might say we live in a democratic state. The majority of the population votes to shut down our borders and all those sorts of things. So, who are we to argue? I think that there might be ways of negotiating with those things. So, one of the problems that a lot of European states have with migration is that they fear that too much might be given away to these people if they enter the territory, or that they'll never leave, and all those sorts of things. So I think that we need to also be designing forms of citizenship that are somewhere between this insider-outsider condition that you describe. So you come into a territory to work for a period of time, to pass through it, but it doesn't mean that instantly you're given the same rights as citizens. There are ways of organizing, of using legal means to organize migration in a way that is not so apocalyptic as a lot of, for instance, agricultural breakdown, which can cause mass exodus from the land. Well, a lot of that is seasonal. Agricultural cycles don't need all the people at all times. So if your land is not generating much income, then you want to send people away to work for part of the season, and they'll come back again. So having sort of what some people have called circular migration, you come in for a bit, you do some work, you don't leave and drain your home country of all its youth, energy, intelligence. You earn some money and you go back, and you remain embedded in your community, and you expand the sort of resources of your community in terms of knowledge, finances, etc. These are also ways, currently, because the nation-state system imagines a sedentary citizen, if you leave and go somewhere else, it's assumed you're going to stay there. It's very difficult to go back again because you get embedded in sort of bureaucratic systems. And if you leave, then you might fear never being able to come back again, because these are the kind of penalties of sedentary life. So we need to normalize movement in ways that make it easier for both sort of resistant destination countries and migrants themselves to imagine a world in which it is not a sort of zero-sum game where one place loses, another place gains, etc. So in these ways, fine. I mean, if you're accustomed to movement in some kind of way, maybe it's easier to imagine these things. But I think that we're also blackmailed a little bit by the way that these things enter public conversation. Migrants have become such a kind of hysterical presence within the sort of national body. I think we have to sort of diffuse a lot of that energy and normalize this, because the numbers, I think, in the next few decades are truly enormous compared to what exists now, and now is already very big.
I mean, I couldn't agree more that some sort of empathy, some sort of recognition that these are other humans who are just also trying to do best by themselves and their families would be a good thing. The world that you're describing accurately, I should say, reminds me. So we're having this conversation in Venice, Italy, at the tail end of the Biennale, and the Nigerian pavilion has a large poster outside, large sign on the outside of the building that just says, "No condition is permanent." And I think that's something that we would all do well to remember and really build in. So I want to play with this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We build for permanence. We build our institutions for permanence. We build our buildings for permanence. We build our lives, usually, with some sense. At least if those of us who are lucky enough, I think, to expect permanence. And we should remember that a lot of people, I think, don't. But how do we then build this world? So you've talked about legal regimes, but how might this play out, this idea of semi-nomadic lifestyles, or lifestyles that makes it sound too optional almost, this reality of returning to semi-nomadic lives. I mean, how could this play out in art, in architecture? I mean, how do we build buildings for this condition?
I mean, a lot of the world is already nomadic in some way or another. I mean, the residents of the global countryside, many of them are already doing what I was just describing. They are going to the city for some months in the year to earn some money. They're sending their kids to another country to work in a factory to send money home. They have in fact, the bottom 50% of the world is far more distributed, has distributed its opportunities and costs between nation states in very remarkable ways as a response to changes in the world in the last few decades. So it's not like everything has to be invented. Yes, there are problems. I think one of the big problems is educating kids. Seasonal agricultural workers who are moving with agricultural cycles, doing labor here on this crop and then moving to another state. And one of the huge problems is that either they have to leave their kids at home with their parents who may or may not be alive, or they have to take their kids with them, and kids basically grow up in fields. So in terms of permanence, I think schools is one major issue. But again, nomadic societies, a lot of the things that we're talking about here as very strange or whatever, or very fragile, actually in history were very normal and very robust. So if you read, I was reading recently a Russian account of staying with some Kazakh tribes in the 19th century, and finding that these tribes were extremely educated, that they were Muslim tribes. The teenage girls were extremely learned. There was great surplus in this economy, that visitors were treated with feasts. They were very well traveled. They traded with Paris. They traded with Moscow, and there was the kind of urban outsider viewed this as an extremely flourishing society in which his own concerns of religion, the visitor also was a Muslim, he found these people very pious, extremely learned in the Quran. Again, the commons, we talk about the commons as something that is sort of very endangered and everything. I mean, if you look at English common law until the immense battles of enclosure sort of reached their height in the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of those landowners lost their legal battles against the commons because the commons was very, very robust. You couldn't just take it. That was the whole point. And aristocrats who tried to physically enclose it or take possession of it, their walls would be broken down and courts would throw out their cases. There are these kinds of social systems, legal systems, etc., they have in history been extremely well integrated into world systems. They've had, and everybody has respected the fundamental purpose of these how these things will fit together. And so I think when you say permanence, I mean, I think we should also view a lot of what has happened between, let's say, 1945 and 2024 as temporary.
An anomaly.
Yes, that certain things were tried that were not generalizable in time or space. Certain systems were dispersed over the entire planet, which led to the very, very rapid depletion of planetary resources. So this is the temporary thing. And if we look at history more generally, we see that a lot of the things we speak of as sort of future prospects or utopias have actually been just normal parts of our social and political life.
So one political form that historically has dealt better with things like migration and circular migration particularly is today a dirty word, which is empires. And I'm curious, could some sort of a return to an imperial concept maybe be better suited for the world that you're describing?
Well, I think that we have to be, I think we need to be very mature about the way that we look at empires in history, because large-scale political organization has usually been empires in world history. And Europe is just a big distraction. I mean, the fact is that when the Roman Empire broke up, Europe never succeeded in reintegrating. And therefore, this set of little competing states, massively invested in war, becomes our norm, has recently become our norm for looking at the world. But actually, big empires, I'm thinking of, say, Mesoamerican empires, the Chinese Empire, Persia,
Mongols.
And the Mongols, though that was a less stable form than these others, the Ottomans. These systems are definitely worthy of our attention. Again, coming back to your word permanence. I mean, nothing in national history can compete with the longevity, let's say, of China. So something must be right in that history. They must have designed some kind of political stability that works. And I think that these are definitely things that we need to look at. So the word empire has become a bit toxic for us because we think primarily of the sort of national colonialism of Europe. But this is not the kind of typical model of empire, because when the British or the Dutch or the French colonized territories, mostly those territories were very far away. Mm-hmm. And there was never any prospect that people in those territories would have the same kind of citizenship as people in the home territory. These were very short-term, generally unsustainable projects of depletion of foreign resources, labor forces, etc., for the purpose of quite rapid and, again, unsustainable national development. This is completely unlike what the Chinese Empire was. The other thing is that, and more interestingly and productively, that one of the main purposes of European colonialism was to impose a legal system on those territories so that metropolitan investments were secure, resources could be owned and turned into property and all that sort of thing. A lot of these other empires were enclosures for many different legal systems. They did not necessarily seek that level of control of, as long as you paid your taxes, as long as you served in the military or whatever it might be, how you married, what language you spoke, how you educated your children, these things were not necessarily of imperial interest. I'm thinking, for instance, of the comparative harmony of the Ottoman Empire compared to the disaster of the nation states that have inherited those territories that have become completely evacuated of cosmopolitanism, variety, all that sort of thing. So I think it's very important for us to get over our all kinds of feelings that we have about empires and look deeply at how so many people have lived in the past for very long periods of time in ways that are apparently very stable. The other thing about China is that China had a deep symbiotic relationship with nomadic tribes. China expanded a very intensive agricultural system up to its borders and used nomadic tribes to commercialize its surplus, to trade with the Middle East, with Europe, etc. And so these systems were integrated and had kind of separate roles. So again, these are much more capacious systems than nation states. They can accommodate vastly different areas of life. What we call multiculturalism in nation states is as long as 99% of you is identical, then we can tolerate 1% of difference. But empires could tolerate total incommensurability. There is absolutely no form of similarity that we share. We talk about each other as total alien beings, but we inhabit the same space and we collaborate on all kinds of projects, and we respect that you know how to do this and we know how to do this, and this is good. So I think these are models that we need to be, lose our historical distance from and take these as future projects, as projects of future political design, rather than thinking that they're sort of quaint past things and the nation state owns all of modern life, because the nation state is failing in very conspicuous ways, and we need to be very, very promiscuous in our attempt to look for inspirations in the future.
One particular counter history that we could look at for inspiration comes, I think, actually out of the French Empire itself, in the last years of the French Empire, when there were concrete proposals made, particularly by African and Caribbean anti-colonial leaders, who basically proposed to France. Well, first of all, they said, you made a commitment, the state to citizens. You fight our wars. So this is the years after World War II. You fight for the nation, and we'll take care of you. And the imperial subjects said, well, wait a minute. We also fought in those wars. We'd like to be taken care of as well. So there were proposals to basically flatten the French Empire and say that all of the parts in Africa and the Caribbean and elsewhere could essentially join some sort of common rule alongside metropolitan France. And of course, the French response was, actually, why don't you just become independent? Because that's not going to happen. Do you see kind of inspirational models or ideas that we can build with, that we could play with, coming out of other historical episodes like that?
I do, absolutely. I think there are lots of tragedies associated with decolonization. In my book, I give After Nations, which is where I've examined all these things, I give a very dark picture of European empire. But there are lots of unintended consequences to all kinds of, to these sorts of projects. And one of the consequences of British rule, let's say in India, I say India because rule there was relatively long. A lot of the African possessions, it was much shorter, is that you produce feelings of membership on the part of many people, especially Indian elites, the bourgeoisie and clerical class, who start campaigning for equality within the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And people like Tagore, of course, Tagore comes from an immensely privileged, wealthy, educated family. He's not representative necessarily of Indians. He's living during times of enormous famines and terrible things going on in the Indian countryside. But someone like Tagore, who writes against patriotism and says, I don't belong to any nation, despises the European idea of nations, he's looking for citizenship of the British Empire. And there are, as you say, the French Empire has a lot of this going on. There are so London and Paris become extremely cosmopolitan zones. A lot of the expats or the migrants who travel from the fringes of the empire to the center, they join forces with intellectuals, artists, etc., in France and Britain, and form this sort of global cosmopolitan activist communities that I think were very, very inspiring for a lot of the people concerned. And people like Orwell, who are in these circles in London in the 1920s and 30s, were actually very disappointed when a lot of these, let's say, Indians went back to India and decided, okay, now I'm going to become an Indian bureaucrat or an Indian novelist or whatever. And Orwell says, I didn't realize they were Indian until India existed. I thought we were all part of a kind of universal project. And so there is a kind of nationalization of consciousness that's happened in the last 70, 80 years, which has limited our ability to think about lots of these kinds of problems. And it's quite recent and is quite manufactured. And there are lots of other ways of being in the world that would allow us to feel that, the problems of the Democratic Republic of Congo are not remote problems, but intimate problems that all of us are part of.
So, of course, in the same period of decolonization, while the rest of the world becomes national and establishes their sovereign territories, the site of creation of these ideas, Europe, moves somewhat in the opposite direction with the formation of the bodies that eventually end up being the European Union, which, among many other things, has been a big experiment in free migration. And I mean, one of the amazing things that Europe has done, get to the question of circular migration, is the Erasmus Scholarship and the movement of students totally freely across the continent to study elsewhere. I'm curious, what is this a potential model for the future? This sort of pooling of sovereignty, this kind of supranational organization. I'm curious whether you think it's what you think of it, and also whether you think it could have only happened in Europe, because they got to be sovereign for quite a while, and that all the the other experiments with pooled sovereignty that were tried or offered. You could think of the United Arab Republic, the merging of Egypt and Syria in the name of pan-Arab nationalism in the 50s, 60s, of course, collapsed. So I'm curious, to what extent is the European Union, what does it offer us to look into the future?
I mean, the CIA wanted the EU and it did not want the United Arab Republic. That's one answer to that. I mean, I think that, so yes, one thing is obvious. The continent that invented the nation state is the first to move away from it in any kind of dramatic way. And the EU, as a British citizen who recently lost my EU citizenship, I feel this very keenly. The EU is a magnificent project in all kinds of ways, as you describe. However, the EU, as a liberal project, as a project that aims to, in some ways, represent sort of a kind of liberal internationalism, that has some concept of constraining the violence of states, constraining the ability of states to legislate against their citizens, that seeks to universalize across this territory certain kinds of liberal values and norms. It turns out that those things are very expensive. It is to deliver democracy, to deliver very strong legal protections, to deliver certain norms of economic growth and economic stability. All of these things are extremely expensive in terms not only of money, but also in terms of institutions and protections and security and all these things. So I think while people who hold a passport of one of those member states are very have all kinds of wonderful opportunities. I don't know to what extent this is generalizable outside of Europe. Obviously, the EU borders are some of the most violent borders in the world. And the EU, for all its sort of gentleness internally, is not gentle outside. The North African coast is a place of horror. And it is Frontex that is sort of, maintaining a lot of the system of sort of surveillance, prisons, all those sorts of things that is going on there. It is Frontex that is sort of behind a lot of the expulsions into the Sahara, the human trafficking, all this stuff. So I think what we do have to acknowledge that there is a relationship between economic wealth and the sort of liberal rights, etc., that we have in Europe. And I think that the EU, in that sense, is part of the segregation of opportunity, the segregation of war, poverty, ecological destruction from the surplus of the system, in ways that mean that at some level the EU is just functioning like a big state, with very hard borders and all those sorts of things. So I personally am very invested in the idea of taking certain concepts of the EU and applying them in the Middle East, for instance, because I do think that in the absence of vast imperial zones like the Ottoman Empire, which managed to create a context of harmony for lots of different religions in the Middle East for several centuries, in the absence of that, maybe something like the EU would be the sort of plausible transition away from basically states bent on each other's total annihilation towards something where it might be possible for those states to view each other's presence as a source of collaboration, cooperation, profit, development, rather than than pure military threat. And I think that the situation of Europe in 1945 was very grave. We shouldn't underestimate it. Maybe there are possibilities like this in the Middle East, but I don't think that the EU is the germ of a planetary sort of politics, because it is absolutely based on hard borders and segregation. So I think that rather than trying to think that, I think it's too far-fetched to imagine that we just spread the EU and invite all the rest of the 193 states to participate. I think we have to imagine more cheaper forms of citizenship that are not that expensive, that do not require such massive infrastructure, but nonetheless can be generalized, so that there are more frugal ways, essentially, to expand membership of international society. And I think the way to start there is economic. I think in the West we're quite obsessed with the idea that we need these rights, and that reality needs to be hyper-managed because we live in a hyper-managed kind of environment. The world is not hyper-managed, and many people are exposed to tremendously violent forces, natural and political. And even a small sort of political resources would improve their situation. I think that in history, citizenship has started with economic things. We didn't start having such a kind of regulated existence. We started simply with economic bargains between state and citizens. And I feel that what we need to be the crucial and most productive task for us right now is to create currency regimes that will free a lot of the global population from their dependence on currencies issued by states. States issue currencies that are exchangeable with the dollar. To issue those currencies in sufficient quantities that their populations can sort of circulate and transact in a rich way is very, very difficult for many, many states. They simply don't have those kinds of resources there's simply not enough money in their system. So many people are poor, not because they have nothing to do, or they have simply because they have no state-issued currency to transact with each other. I think that states obviously have jealously guarded their monopoly over issuing currencies, but I think that with lessons learned from crypto, lessons learned from historical experiments in complementary currencies, with trust mechanisms that can be that the internet can now deliver, I think we need to start giving people currency tools such that they can, for instance, if they are migrating over large distances, create economies that are transnational economies. Obviously, millions of migrants, this is an economy. These people have to eat, shelter, trade, acquire things, make things. I think we need to be generating a lot more currency tools. Currency tools will be married to identity tools because people will probably have wallets of various kinds. And identity tools can become new forms of citizenship that float free of the nation-state system. But I think, as I say, in the West, we underestimate, because we don't think that currency is a problem. We underestimate the power of simply generating democratic currencies and everything that can be built on top of them. And I think this is a critical way for us to manage both the sort of deprivation, the kind of economic deprivation of large parts of the world, but also the future possibilities of migration.
Are you imagining here a global digital currency? Is this what you have in mind, or?
So I think that different currencies can be invented for different contexts and different needs, and this is not my area of expertise. These are things that would require very intricate economic design and technological design, because not everybody has access to certain kinds of equipment, processing power, etc. But complementary currency projects that have been issued on sort of simple mobile phones by SMS on small scales have been able to multiply the GDP of small communities by thousands of times when there's no access to, say, the Kenyan shilling or whatever. The official currencies that we have right now, which have a monopoly status, largely, I mean, crypto is disrupting that, but largely have a monopoly status, and that monopoly status is being enforced also by actions against crypto in some countries. This currency arises originally primarily from private debt, from debt to private banks. That is interest bearing. So currency is rent. Currency is interest bearing, and in order to keep the economy stable, therefore the economy has to expand, because debt needs to be repaid. Money is always coming at a cost. So a lot of people who are looking at these areas say, well, we should have currencies that have the opposite set of incentives. Money that loses value over time rather than gains value over time. So you have an incentive not to invest it, hoard it, keep it, but to spend it, which massively increases the circulation of an economy. So you can have. I mean, I think my sort of my message in my book is that the problem with the nation state is not the nation state. The problem is monopolies. We have to demonopolize. We have to create alternative systems for people to secure themselves with if one system fails. If you have a set of currencies that is very dynamic, produces all kinds of innovation, but is also extractive, which is also interest-bearing, why not have another set of currencies that are designed for sustainability, that are designed for community, that are designed not to be dynamic, but simply to sustain what exists and to allow people to. We can build different kind of incentive systems in to have complementary economies that do different things. One of which is extractive and dynamic, and another of which is slow growth or zero growth, but is also sustainable and is available easily to the poorest people on the planet.
We've mentioned planetary politics, planetary political thinking once or twice, but you've in many times gone back to regions. We've talked about Middle East, Latin America, Asia as regions, and whether you kind of see that. Do either of those topics pique your interest?
I think one of the things that Europe has done successfully is to provide the possibility of being a member of a much, much larger zone, which has lots of historical precedents. Christendom, the Roman Empire, the papacy, however you want to locate it, it has some sort of historical reality. It's not exactly the same places and borders, but Europe as a concept pre-exists many of its nations, all of its nations, actually. I think many areas of the world no longer have that luxury of belonging simultaneously to a state and to the wider civilization that state was part of. And I do think that one of the things, that the ways that we can live more peacefully is to reanimate some of those transnational regional realities which might be associated with historical empires, trading zones, ecological zones, which are much less belligerent and selfish than nation states. I've mentioned the Middle East, of course, but much of Asia is part of ancient trading systems and religious systems that have a very different valency to the aggression and mutual suspicion of the nation states that inhabited them. And if it would be nice to sort of, as I say, bring these back, these other forms of consciousness. We can belong at all kinds of levels. I don't think human beings have any problem moving between scales, from the very intimate to the universal and everything in between. So I think, when I say demonopolizing, bringing back the smaller and the larger entities and engines that we have been part of in the past and we can again, would all help us to sort of meet in the middle of some of these problems.
Well, thank you so much. This has been
thank you.
Complete pleasure.
It's great fun.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.